Okay, so a jointer is a tool that is used to achieve that first flat edge and flat face and square edge on our wood. So the jointer has two beds or tables. This is the infeed table on the right side and the outfeed table on the left side. There is a cylindrical cutter head that spins towards the infeed table with a series of sharp teeth covering that entire surface. So what happens is that we have the infeed table set slightly below the blades of the cutter head, which are at the same height as the outfeed table. So as we pass our piece of wood along the infeed table, a tiny sliver is going to get taken off by the cutter head, and then it's going to slide supported onto the outfeed table. And what we'll get is a nice smooth surface. So there's a few different adjustments that we need to make in order to make this a safe and smooth operation. So first of all, we can raise or lower the infeed table to take off more or less material. We do that by loosening this knob. And then twisting this knob, you can see it moving up and down. There's a little gauge on the side here. I usually like to start off somewhere between a 64th and a 32nd of an inch. And then as I get a feel for it with the wood that I'm using, I might adjust that to take off more or less. So once you have it set, we're going to make sure we tighten that knob back down. Not too tight. The second adjustment that we can make is the fence. So the fence can move in or out. And we want to make sure we're only exposing as much of the cutter head as we need to expose. Because I'm jointing quite a large piece of material, I'm going to need the full width of that bed. But if I were cutting a thinner piece of wood, I would set this fence to be closer. So once I have it set where I want to set, I can tighten that back down. You can also adjust the angle of the fence. Generally, we want to have it at perfectly 90 degrees, but there are cases where you might want a slightly angled cut. So it's a good idea to check that it's 90 degrees when you first start using it. So I'm going to use this combination square to check the squareness of the fence to the bed. So what I'll do is I'll place the wider part on the bed and slide it up to the fence. And I'm checking to see if there's a gap at the top or the bottom. I see there's a big gap at the top, so that means that this bed is not 90 degrees. So I'll loosen it. So when this is loose, the fence can move in and out like this. I'll adjust it so that I don't see a gap at the top or the bottom of the square. I'll check both the front and the back, and then I'll tighten that down. This fence has a notorious tendency of going out of square every time you use it, so it's a good idea to check each and every time you go to use the jointer. So the jointer has a blade guard which swings away as you're using it in order to protect your fingers. So that's all the adjustments that we can make on the jointer. Once we're ready to cut, we are going to inspect our piece of wood, make sure there are no nails or staples, there's no bits of rocks or dirt that are stuck in there. We want to make sure that we're not damaging the teeth of the cutter head and dulling them over time. We're then going to pick the direction that we're going to feed this piece of wood through. This comes down to a little bit of technique and learning how to read the wood over time. So if you look on the side of your piece of wood, you'll see that every piece of wood has a grain direction. And we're looking on the edge that is facing us when we're using the machine. It's pretty hard to see on this piece, so I'm going to make it more obvious with a Sharpie. So you'll see that the lines of the grain are either traveling uphill or downhill in relation to the wood. Rarely do they go perfectly straight, although if you do get a perfectly straight piece, count yourself lucky. The direction that you feed this piece of wood through the jointer will determine whether or not you get a super smooth cut. If I were to feed this piece of wood through in this direction, you can see that those grain lines are facing downhill. Oop. As the cutter head is coming around, it's coming around in a circle, and it's going to be following those grain lines. So imagine if it's kind of like petting a cat. If we were to pet the cat with the grain or with the fur, we're going to get a nice smooth feeling. If we were to go in the opposite direction, though, it would be rough and uncomfortable. So this is the correct direction on the jointer. If your wood is facing uphill, so if we were to flip it around, the grains would be traveling like that. And in that case, that cutter head is going to come around and it's going to dig into those fibers. So I'll try it both ways, and you can see in one direction you'll get a nice smooth finish, and on the other direction there might be little bits of tear out or rough spots. Sometimes wood changes direction in the middle of your piece, and in that case you're just going to have to pick one and see what works best. And if you get it wrong, you can always just flip it around and try again. It usually takes 2 or 3 passes over the cutter head in order to get a smooth finish. What we can do in order to tell if we've got all of the rough surface taken off is use a pencil to draw all over the face of that piece. And you'll know you've got all of the material removed when you can no longer see that pencil mark. As I'm passing the wood over the jointer cutter head, I want to make sure that I have a nice and stable stance. I'm using both hands to support the piece. If the piece is really long, you might want to set up an extra table or a roller stand, or have someone help you to make sure that that piece is nice and stable. So when we're using the jointer, we always want to make sure we're using push blocks to protect our hands. We never want to have a situation where we're passing our bare hands over that cutter head. You can use these 2 flat paddles, or you can use this single paddle for shorter pieces. This one is great because it applies even pressure across the whole piece. But if you have a long board, you may need to start off with one hand free at the back, and then as the end gets closer to that infeed table, you can reach and grab your second paddle and use it to finish your cut. We want to make sure we're maintaining even steady pressure downwards onto the infeed table. And then as we transition over to the outfeed table, we're sort of shifting our weight and transferring that pressure to the outfeed. If your piece of wood has a bit of a rock or a bit of a twist, we just want to pick one side of that rock and stick with it through the entire cut. If it's rocking as we're cutting, we're going to end up just repeating or amplifying that twist. So once I've removed that entire rough surface, You may notice that there are little bumps or little tracks left behind by the jointer. Those are completely normal and just result from the blades wearing down over time. They can be sanded out easily later or removed on the planer. I've got a nice smooth surface without any tear out, so I'm going to try changing the direction of the wood to see if I can get some tear out to show what that looks like. Pretty hard to see on camera, but if I look closely, I can see some little white spots and a little rough spot here around this sort of difficult area of grain. So that's what might happen if you put your piece through the wrong grain direction over the jointer. So once I have one flat face from the jointer, we're going to do the second step of S4S, which is to create edge that is perpendicular to that first reference face. If you've got a big stack of wood that you're cutting, it's a good idea to mark this face as being complete so that you don't mix it up later. So I like to draw a little swirl on it like that. Now I know that I'm going to take that face and put it against the 90-degree fence and pass that over the cutter head to get a nice 90-degree edge. If you're doing multiple pieces of wood, you can do these two operations at the same time by simply doing the face and then flipping it up and doing the edge without turning off the machine. When we're making this cut, we're going to shift our technique slightly. Instead of putting pressure down on the bed, we're mainly going to be putting pressure against the fence to keep that piece nice and tight at 90 degrees. So what we want to do, I like to use the 2 thumbs up, and so this keeps my fingers from hanging down near the cutter head. And I'm going to place my left thumb on top of the piece like this and my right thumb on the back. So your right hand is pushing forward while your left hand is using your knuckle to gently push against the fence. So what I'll do is slide that across just like that. Because this piece is now vertical, my hands are well away from the cutter head. I don't need to use a push block, and that would also limit my ability to control this piece of wood on the jointer. With the jointer, we don't want to be cutting pieces of wood that are any smaller than about a foot in length. That's because we want to make sure that we have even steady pressure and that a smaller piece can just be more difficult to control. And the notation for when you've jointed an edge of your piece is to draw a small arrow pointing towards your first reference face like that. This helps if you have a bunch of pieces of wood that you've planed. You can stack them up all the same so that they're ready to feed into the planer as the next step.